If you think witches are just fairy tale characters or shadowy figures from ancient stories, prepare to be surprised. The reality is that witchcraft has not only survived through the centuries, but has also shaped the fate of entire civilizations. From the earliest shamanic rituals in prehistoric caves to the fascinating resurgence of the occult in the 19th century, the journey of witches is a powerful reflection of the struggle between knowledge and control, fear and power. It is no wonder that, to this day, the term witch still carries so much mystery and controversy. Did you know that witch hunts were, in fact, one of the cruelest forms of social and political control ever seen in history? Or that some of the most influential figures of all time, from philosophers to kings, feared the invisible power that these women and men supposedly possessed? You may have heard of the Salem witch trials, but few people understand that this hunt was just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger persecution, fueled by centuries of superstition and intolerance. What if I told you that much of what we associate with modern witchcraft, such as the worship of nature and the power of the elements, has its roots in the oldest rituals known to mankind? In this in-depth journey through history, you will discover how the concept of witchcraft has changed over time, the myths that have risen and fallen, and how ancient pagan practices, gods and heroes from Greek, Roman, and Celtic mythologies are intimately linked to this journey. Get ready to unravel the secrets of the sorceresses of ancient Greece. Understand the role of witches in the Middle Ages and how they were brutally persecuted by the Inquisition. More than just a dark tale, this is a story of resistance, power, and above all, an invitation to reevaluate the true essence of what we call witchcraft. Before any concept of witch as we know it today, early human beings were already connecting with the supernatural through nature. Groups of hunter-gatherers were surrounded by mysteries they could not explain. The cycle of the seasons, the death and rebirth of plants, the stars in the sky. From there, the first rituals emerged, based on a deep reverence for the natural elements and the powers that governed their lives. These primitive practices are the foundation of what would later come to be known as witchcraft, marked by chants, dances, and symbols that echoed the symbiosis with the surrounding environment. These first spiritual manifestations, often centered on female figures, place women as the guardians of the mysteries of the earth and life. They were the healers, the shamans who understood the secrets of plants and the cycles of the moon. In ancient civilizations, such as the Celts and the Egyptians, priestesses played an essential role, bringing to light a sacred connection between the feminine and the gods. It is no coincidence that women in many cultures were seen as capable of moving between the physical and spiritual worlds, with their healing and divination practices both revered and feared. But prehistoric witchcraft was not just about worship or magic. It was deeply connected to survival. The ancients knew that to ensure abundant harvests and protection from natural dangers, they needed to appeal to spirits and higher powers. These mystical practices reflected the reality of their lives, where each element, earth, water, fire, and air, had a guardian spirit or entity. These rituals, often shrouded in legend and myth, such as tales of heroes who tamed the forces of nature, are a reflection of a society that lived in harmony, and sometimes in fear, with the unseen world. Today, some modern groups that follow neo-pagan practices, such as Wicca, draw heavily from these ancient roots. They celebrate Sabbats and Esbats, events based on the cycles of the moon and the seasons, a direct homage to what our ancestors did thousands of years ago. If you've ever felt an inexplicable connection while walking through a forest or watching the sunset, know that you're getting in touch with something very old, something that dates back to the first humans trying to understand the world around them. And this search for meaning is the heart of witchcraft. In ancient Greece, witchcraft was already beginning to take on more defined forms and intertwine with mythology and religion. Figures such as Circe and Hecate are iconic examples of this intersection between the divine and the mystical. Circe, known as the sorceress who transformed men into animals, is a classic representation of feminine power and magic. Her story, immortalized by Homer in the Odyssey, reveals a mix of magic, the power of transformation, and the ability to control the forces of nature. In ancient times, she was not only seen as a villain, but also as a guardian of hidden knowledge, of feared and revered ability. Hecate, in turn, is one of the most mysterious goddesses in Greek mythology. She rules the night paths, crossroads, and the mysteries of magic, and is often depicted holding torches and keys, symbols of her ability to guide between worlds. Her connection to the moon, the underworld, and the dead makes her a central figure in the practice of witchcraft, especially necromancy, a form of magic aimed at communicating with the spirits of the dead. Hecate is still revered in some modern practices of witchcraft and neopaganism, and is seen as a goddess of feminine power and intuition. In Greece, magic was not limited to mythological figures. There were also sorcerers and priests who practiced a form of magic known as Goetia. This practice involved invoking spirits and gods to grant wishes, often in very practical ways, such as protecting crops or winning love. It is interesting to note how the ancient Greeks saw witchcraft and magic as tools for interacting directly with the divine world, especially in a context where the gods were part of everyday life. The offerings, spells, and rituals they performed were deeply rooted in their culture and religion. The Eleusinian Mysteries, a series of secret rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, also brought a profound spiritual dimension to the witchcraft of the time. These rituals, performed at Eleusis, were shrouded in secrecy and promised initiates a deeper understanding of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. While not necessarily witchcraft in the sense we understand it today, they reflected the use of ritual and ceremony to access sacred knowledge. The relationship between magic, mysteries, and religion is a constant throughout history, and in ancient Greece this line was almost indistinguishable. With the rise and spread of Christianity during the Middle Ages, witchcraft began to be viewed in a very different light, changing from a practice that was often respected or feared to something considered heretical. The Christian Church, in its effort to consolidate power and eliminate any spiritual competition, began to associate pagan and magical practices with evil, the devil, and the corruption of the soul. During this period, many of the ancient rituals of connection with nature and the ancient gods were demonized, being seen as dangerous pagan influences that needed to be eradicated. This confrontation between Christianity and witchcraft was, to a large extent, an ideological battle. Christianity preached the belief in a single, benevolent God, while any practice that involved invoking forces of nature, gods or spirits, was seen as a threat to divine authority and the established social order. The first records of witches as enemies of the Christian faith began to appear during this period, with reports of women, mainly, being accused of witchcraft and of making pacts with the devil. Interestingly, many of these practices that began to be condemned by the church were simply remnants of ancient religious and healing traditions. A clear example of this clash can be found in rural Europe, where populations, especially in more isolated areas, still practice their ancestral rituals. Ancient beliefs in earth spirits, such as fairies or elemental beings, common in Celtic folklore, were part of everyday life, and healers, often called witches, were seen as an essential part of the community. They treated illnesses, predicted the weather, and protected crops. But under the watchful eye of the church, these women began to be accused of heresy and diabolical practices in an attempt to erase these cultural traditions. Over time, tensions intensified, especially as the church established itself as the dominant force in Europe. Pagan rituals that had once celebrated the gods and the earth became synonymous with witchcraft, and witchcraft in turn became associated with devil worship. It was a powerful strategy that not only eliminated spiritual competition, but also justified social control and the repression of ancient beliefs. This conflict would explode into one of the darkest periods in history, which we will discuss shortly: the witch hunts. The relationship between the feminine and witchcraft has deep roots, dating back to ancient societies in which women were seen as guardians of knowledge of nature, healing, and spirituality. In ancient civilizations, women played a central role in mystical practices. They were healers, shamans, priestesses, figures respected for their ability to deal with plants, lunar cycles, and the mysteries of life and death. This ancient power, intimately linked to the feminine, created an aura of respect and, at the same time, fear around them. As monotheistic religions, especially Christianity, took hold, this view changed dramatically. Women's connection to magic, previously seen as a spiritual connection, came to be interpreted as something dangerous and even demonic. In medieval society, the role of women became increasingly restricted, and any expression of feminine power, especially that which involved healing, predictions, or connection with nature, was quickly labeled as witchcraft. What was once reverence turned into persecution. The wise woman who healed with herbs came to be seen as a threat to the Christian order. The concept of the witch as a dangerous and seductive female figure grew during this period. The image of the witch as an independent and powerful woman was a direct affront to the ideal of feminine submission promoted by the church and patriarchal society. Many women who were accused of witchcraft had not, in fact, been involved in magical practices, but represented a type of freedom or power that the dominant system could not tolerate. This was one of the reasons why so many women were targeted for persecution, especially those who lived on the margins of society or who did not conform to expected gender roles. Throughout the centuries, this association between the feminine and witchcraft persisted. The persecution of witches became a way of controlling not only spiritual practices, but also feminine expression itself. The history of witchcraft is, in large part, a history of oppression of women who dared to exist outside the established norms. This legacy of persecution still reverberates in the way female power is viewed today, but it also resurfaces in movements that seek to reclaim this ancestral power. In neo-pagan practices and in some modern feminist circles, the image of the witch is recovered as a symbol of resistance and strength. It is proof that, despite centuries of oppression, female power is resilient. During the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe plunged into one of the darkest periods in its history, the witch hunts. Driven by the Inquisition, a series of investigations and trials promoted by the Catholic Church, the witch hunts were in fact a powerful tool of social control. Fear of the supernatural was manipulated to justify religious and political domination. Through accusations of witchcraft, often unfounded, the Church and the authorities could silence, punish, or eliminate those who represented a threat to the status quo, whether they were dissidents, heretics, or even personal enemies. The manual Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and James Springer, was a major catalyst for this persecution. The book, widely distributed and respected by ecclesiastical authorities, described in detail how to identify, judge, and punish witches. The Malleus reinforced the idea that women, in general, were more likely to fall prey to the devil's temptations, thus perpetuating misogyny and the persecution of women accused of witchcraft. With its cruel instructions, the book became a veritable Bible for witch hunters, fueling fear and paranoia throughout Europe. The terror that followed was devastating. Witch hunts were not limited to real occult practices, but affected ordinary, often innocent people. Any behavior considered out of the ordinary could be interpreted as a sign of witchcraft. From a simple argument with neighbors to the inability to explain natural disasters or crop failures, everything was a pretext for an accusation. In many towns and villages, paranoia took hold, and in a highly religious and superstitious society, few dared to defend the accused. Torture was widely used to extract confessions, and thousands of people, mostly women, were burned at the stake or hanged. Although witch hunts occurred primarily in Europe, their effects spread to colonial America, where fear of the occult also claimed its victims. But central to these persecutions was the strategic use of fear to consolidate power. By promoting witch hunts, the Inquisition created an atmosphere of constant terror, where anyone could be accused and convicted. Most tragically, these accusations were often motivated by political issues, land disputes, or simply personal revenge. The psychological and social impact of these persecutions is immeasurable, but the scars they left are a reminder of how fear and superstition can be used to control and oppress. The most famous case of witch hunts in colonial America occurred in 1692 in the small town of Salem, Massachusetts. What began as suspicions and accusations among neighbors quickly turned into mass hysteria that resulted in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of dozens more. The Salem witchcraft scare was fueled by a combination of religious fear, social tensions, and a need to find scapegoats for problems the colonists faced, such as disease, food shortages, and economic hardship. Accusations were often unfounded and based on personal rivalries or an inability to explain natural phenomena. The Salem witch trials have been widely studied as an example of how fear can lead to social and political injustices. Young women who initially began exhibiting behaviors considered strange, such as screaming, convulsing, and claims of demonic visions, soon accused other women in the village of witchcraft. Once the accusations began, they spread quickly, and the population, steeped in a strong Puritan culture, believed that any sign of unusual behavior could be the result of witchcraft. The consequences were devastating, and those who tried to defend the accused often ended up being accused themselves. Although Salem is the best-known case, it was not the only one. Other American colonies were also affected by the witchcraft scare. In Connecticut, for example, there have been several witch trials even before Salem, with some women being executed for their alleged use of black magic. In both cases, the motives for these accusations were a mix of fervent religious belief and the need to find someone to blame for the problems facing the community. Witchcraft became a convenient explanation for disasters that were beyond human control, such as crop failures, sudden deaths, and even bad weather. The legacy of Salem and other colonial witch hunts goes beyond fear of the supernatural. They remind us of the dangers of allowing irrational fear and intolerance to take over reason and justice. To this day, Salem stands as a symbol of mass hysteria and abuse of power, a warning of what can happen when religious fanaticism and mistrust collide. The story of the Salem witches has resonated throughout the centuries and continues to be studied as a classic example of how society can transform the unknown and misunderstood into something feared and, tragically, persecuted. With the advent of the Renaissance and, later, the Enlightenment, Europe began to experience profound cultural, scientific, and philosophical transformations that changed the way witchcraft was viewed. During the Renaissance, a renewed interest in the arts and science emerged, and at the same time, ancient occult knowledge regained ground. Many scholars of the time began to investigate alchemy, astrology, and other forms of magic that had previously been viewed with suspicion. Witchcraft, however, remained in a zone of tension, being both a symbol of forbidden wisdom and of danger. During this period, figures such as Giordano Bruno stood out. Bruno was a philosopher and mystic who defended the idea of an infinite universe and the divine presence in all things. His views, which included esoteric practices such as ceremonial magic, brought him into direct conflict with the Catholic Church, culminating in his execution in 1600. Cases such as Bruno's show how, even in an age of rediscovery of knowledge, fear of witchcraft and the occult still permeated society, especially when these practices challenged prevailing religious beliefs. With the Enlightenment, however, attitudes toward witchcraft began to change more significantly. The rationalist movement brought with it a new way of thinking, based on science and reason, that challenged old superstitions and fears of the supernatural. Philosophers such as Voltaire and John Locke openly criticized the persecution of witches, arguing that it was irrational to believe in witchcraft and pacts with the devil. Popular belief in witchcraft began to wane, and witch trials became less frequent as societies adopted a more scientific and rational stance. Yet even with the decline of witch hunts and the emergence of a more skeptical view, the figure of the witch did not disappear entirely. The modern age was marked by a new kind of fascination with the occult, which mixed with the emerging science. Many women, especially those who continued to practice natural healing and ancient wisdom, were still viewed with suspicion. They represented a link between the old mystical world and the new rational world. This duality has continued to mark the trajectory of witchcraft in popular culture and the collective imagination. Throughout history, courts have been the scene of witchcraft trials that have left their mark on the popular imagination, with devastating consequences for the accused. One of the most iconic cases was that of Joan of Arc, who, in 1431, was accused of heresy and witchcraft. Joan, a young peasant girl who claimed to hear divine voices, led the French army during the 100 Years' War. Her sudden rise and military success caused discomfort among the ecclesiastical and political elites. Accused of using spells to achieve her victories, Joan was tried and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Her case is emblematic, as it shows how the accusation of witchcraft was often a political tool. Another famous trial was that of the Pendle witches in England in 1612. In this episode, a total of 12 people, most of them women, were accused of practicing witchcraft and causing the deaths of several people in the community. The Pendle trial was notable for the number of defendants and the impact it had on British witchcraft legislation. The confessions, obtained under torture, and the witnesses, often children, reinforced the paranoia surrounding witchcraft at the time. The result was the execution of 10 of the accused, who went down in history as victims of an era of hysteria and fear. The trials in Scotland are also notable, especially the North Berwick witch trial of 1590, which even included charges of conspiracy against King James VI of Scotland, the future James I of England. A number of women were accused of gathering in satanic ceremonies to conjure up storms that threatened the king's life. These trials were driven by political and religious concerns, and the confessions, often forced under torture, resulted in brutal executions. The witch hunts in Scotland were among the most intense in Europe, and fear of witchcraft remained strong for decades. Witchcraft trials, at their core, were less about magical practices and more about social, political, and religious control. In many cases, the accused were marginalized individuals, especially women, who defied societal norms or who simply became convenient targets in times of crisis. These trials reveal much about the mindset of the time and the use of witchcraft as a tool of oppression. When looking back at these historical events, it is impossible not to realize the profound consequences they had, not only for the victims, but for society as a whole, creating a legacy of fear and superstition that endured for centuries. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the line between science and magic was extremely blurred, and nowhere was this more evident than in alchemy. A precursor to modern chemistry, alchemy was a practice that sought to transform base metals into gold, discover the philosopher's stone, and find the elixir of eternal life. However, alchemists were often viewed with suspicion, being associated with occult practices and, consequently, witchcraft. This is because alchemical processes often involved esoteric symbols and rituals that, to the eyes of the more religious, bordered on the supernatural. Many alchemists, such as Paracelsus and Nicholas Flamel, were both scientists and mystics. While they sought to unlock the secrets of matter, they also sought to understand the mysteries of the universe and the soul. Witchcraft, in this context, was seen as a practice that, like alchemy, dealt with invisible forces. Alchemists and witches share a common curiosity, the desire to understand and manipulate the hidden forces of nature. However, alchemy, because of its association with the principles of science, has largely managed to escape the same persecution that plagued practitioners of witchcraft. One of the most fascinating figures in this connection between witchcraft and alchemy is John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England. Dee was one of the most brilliant minds of his time, but he was also deeply involved in the occult. He corresponded with angels, according to his own words, and developed the system of Enochian magic, a supposedly divine language. To modern eyes, Dee may seem like a curious mix of scientist and magician, but for his time, he was a symbol of how knowledge of nature and the occult were intertwined. However, while alchemy eventually gave rise to modern chemistry, witchcraft remained marginalized, seen as superstition or heresy. The quest to transform metals or prolong life was seen as a noble scientific endeavor, while the use of herbs to heal or spells to protect were seen as dangerous practices. This distinction reflects more social and religious context than the practices themselves. After all, both witches and alchemists dealt with the invisible forces of the natural world. The difference was that alchemy gradually managed to legitimize itself as a science, while witchcraft, because of its association with feminine power and the occult, continued to be repressed and feared. In the 19th century, witchcraft began to take on a new form, morphing into something more in line with occult practices, influenced by the esotericism, spiritualism, and mystical movements that flourished at the time. While the witch hunts had declined considerably, interest in the occult was gaining momentum, especially in Western societies. This transition did not happen abruptly, but was the result of a convergence between traditional mysticism, ancient witchcraft practices, and a growing curiosity about the mysteries of the soul, the afterlife, and universal secrets. Victorian salons, famous for their seances, witnessed this revival of interest in the supernatural. A central figure in this period was the occultist Helena Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky traveled the world in search of esoteric wisdom and was instrumental in bringing the occult to the forefront of intellectual and spiritual discussions of the time. Her works, such as The Secret Doctrine, blended mystical teachings with elements of science and philosophy, and helped create fertile ground for the fusion of ancient magical practices, such as witchcraft, with new occult concepts. The 19th century witch, in this new light, was no longer seen as an isolated and feared figure in the shadows, but as someone who sought occult knowledge, aligning herself with a more intellectual tradition. The emergence of magical orders, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, was another important milestone in the transition from witchcraft to the occult. Founded in 1887, the Golden Dawn brought together practitioners of ceremonial magic, alchemists, occultists, and those interested in expanding their consciousness through the study of the esoteric. This organization attracted intellectuals, writers, and mystics who sought not only to understand the hidden laws of the universe, but also to apply them to their lives. The practice of magic, and by extension witchcraft, began to be seen as a form of self-discovery and spiritual enlightenment, rather than simply a means of manipulating the physical world. The transition from witchcraft to the occult in the 19th century also marked the beginning of a cultural reinterpretation of the witch figure. Movements such as Romanticism celebrated the power of imagination, nature, and mystery, making the image of the witch more of a representation of the other, a figure of resistance against extreme rationality and industrialization. Writers and artists began to rediscover the old legends and recreate the witch as a tragic, mysterious, and even empowered character. This paved the way for the 20th century, when witchcraft would re-emerge as part of the neo-pagan movement, but now in a new light. And so we come to the end of this intriguing story. But is it really the end? As we have seen, witchcraft has never really disappeared. It has merely changed form, adapted, survived, the haunt, the bonfire, the fear. Each era has tried, in its own way, to extinguish this invisible power. But how can we extinguish something that pulses so strongly in the shadows of history? The truth is that witches have always been among us, hidden in the crossroads of mythology, legends, and perhaps even in the whispers of the wind on a moonless night. Centuries of persecution have turned witches into legends, but legends never die. They hide, they transform, and when you least expect it, they resurface. Who knows? While you sleep, they still walk through the dark forests, evoking ancient magics, laughing at those who believe they had won. Witchcraft, after all, is not just a practice. It is an enigma, a force that transcends time. No matter how much the world changes, the mystery will always be lurking, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. So, as the centuries go by and new stories are written, the question remains: is there still someone somewhere who lights a candle on Samhain night, summoning the ancient spirits? Are the legends you have heard just stories, or are there echoes of truth within them? The witch's journey continues. The question is, will you dare to go on and discover what is still hidden?